She took my medicine, not by mistake, not because she didn't know. She looked me straight in the eye and said, "There's no need to waste money on pills for someone your age." Then she slipped the bottle into her handbag like it was nothing, like I was nothing. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time after she left. The room still smelled faintly of her perfume. Something expensive and overly sweet, the kind that clung to the walls long after the person had gone. My nightstand drawer hung half open, empty now. No pills, no explanation. Just her voice still echoing in my head. No need to waste money on you. I'd never missed a dose in 8 years, not since Dr. Sander prescribed that medication after my second episode. He said I needed to stay on it permanently, not because I was dying, but because I was living, and wanted to keep doing so with some dignity. But apparently, dignity was a luxury in my daughter's eyes. I should have said something right then. Should have raised my voice, demanded the bottle back, told her she had no right. But I didn't. I just sat there, frozen. At 74, you learn to let a lot of things go for the sake of peace. You tell yourself maybe they didn't mean it like that. Maybe they're just tired, stressed, distracted. But this wasn't the first time, not even the first week. It had been building up slowly over the past year. The condescending comments, the missed calls, the last-minute grocery deliveries with dented cans and stale bread. The way she'd stop answering halfway through my sentence. "You already told me that, Mother." Always in that voice. Clipped, efficient, like she was managing me, not listening. She used to be different. When Robert died, Caroline moved in for a while, said she wanted to make sure I was okay. Back then, she brought me fresh groceries, sat with me after dinner, asked how I was sleeping. But that was 10 years ago, before her second divorce, before the new job in finance, before she started talking about asset optimization and long-term care planning, like I was a spreadsheet, not her mother. Now she visits once a month, sometimes less. When she does, she never stays longer than half an hour. She talks about the cost of everything, her rent, her car, her gym, the rising bills, and somehow I always end up feeling guilty for having survived this long. That morning, I'd made tea like always. Set out the good china. I even baked scones, from scratch, the way she liked them as a child. I thought maybe today would be different. Maybe she'd sit with me a while. Maybe she'd ask how I was feeling, how I was really doing. Instead, she arrived with her phone in her hand and a Bluetooth headset tucked into one ear. 15 minutes, Mom, she said, before she even crossed the threshold. I've got a Zoom call with the hospital finance board. That was the only word I remembered afterward. Finance. She didn't notice the scones, didn't taste the tea. She asked if I'd reviewed the home care brochure she left last time. I hadn't. I told her I was fine living alone, that I had my routine, my neighbors, my little garden, that I still had all my wits. That's when she asked if I was still taking my medication. I said yes, of course I was. That it helped. She opened the drawer without asking, took out the bottle, read the label. You still take these? Yes. She looked at me, tilted her head slightly. These cost over $600 every refill. I didn't answer. She already knew that. I paid out of pocket because my insurance didn't cover this specific brand. Because I refused the generic. It made me dizzy. We'd had this conversation before, and then she said it. There's no need to waste money on you. Just like that. As if she were talking about throwing out expired milk. She put the bottle in her bag and walked out before I could say a word. I sat on the bed and stared at the floor. My hands didn't move. My heart did, though. Thudding louder than usual, not from panic, but from something deeper. Something I hadn't felt in years. Anger. Not the sharp kind that burns fast and leaves you empty. No, this was colder. It settled deep in my bones. It stayed. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a pen and a small ledger. The same one I used to track Robert's medication expenses in the last months. I opened it to a fresh page and wrote across the top what they take and what I give. Underneath, I wrote, 1 bottle of Metaxira, 643 Trust, not quantifiable silence, willingly given, no longer free. Then I made myself tea, not to calm down, but to stay alert, because something had shifted, and I was finally paying attention. The next morning, I woke up with a heaviness behind my eyes, the kind that settles in after a night of thinking instead of sleeping. I sat up slowly, knees protesting as always, and reached for the drawer, half out of habit, half out of denial. Still empty. For a second, I thought maybe I'd imagined it, that maybe the pills were in the cabinet instead, or the fridge, or God knows where. But deep down, I knew the truth. Caroline had taken them, and she wasn't coming back with replacements. I sat at the kitchen table and stirred my oatmeal, watching it thicken without appetite. Then I picked up the phone and dialed the pharmacy. "Good morning, Mrs. Johnson," the pharmacist said, cheerful as ever. "How can we help you today?" "I need to refill my Metaxira prescription," I said, keeping my voice steady. He hesitated. "You're not due for a refill until the 14th. "Yes," I said. "I know. But it's gone. I need another bottle." He didn't ask why it was gone, didn't question. Just said, "All right, I'll see what we can do. It'll be ready this afternoon, same price." I didn't flinch. I said thank you and hung up. Then I walked to the drawer where I kept my financial papers and pulled out my checkbook. The savings were still there. Enough for the bills, the medicine, the food. But not endless. That's what Caroline didn't understand. She saw a bank account and thought it meant power. She didn't see the years it took to build it, all the corners we cut in our marriage, the secondhand coats, the grocery coupons, the jobs I took on weekends after Robert's death, just to keep things steady. She'd never had to struggle, not the way I did. And maybe that was my fault. By noon, I had the pills. The pharmacist gave me a polite smile and a small paper bag, and I carried it like it was made of glass. When I got home, I placed the bottle back in the drawer, carefully, like it was a returned part of me. Then I locked the drawer and slipped the key into my apron pocket. Let her try again. That afternoon, the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find Caroline standing there, holding a plastic bag from some discount grocery store. "I brought you some things," she said, avoiding my eyes. Inside the bag, bruised apples, a half loaf of white bread, a carton of milk with tomorrow's expiration date. "Thanks," I said, taking the bag. Very thoughtful. She crossed her arms. "Are you okay?" "You didn't call." "You took my medicine," I said plainly. She flinched. "I didn't take it. I borrowed it. I was going to come back with something cheaper." "It wasn't yours to borrow," I said, "and I'm not switching medications." She sighed, exasperated. "Mom, you're being unreasonable. That stuff is overpriced. There's a generic version for a third of the cost." And that generic makes me sick. She looked down at the floor, then back up. "You can't keep spending like this. You'll run out." "I'd rather run out with dignity than live like a shadow." That stopped her. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, lips tightening. "I'm just trying to help." No, I said. You're trying to manage. There's a difference. We stood in silence for a moment. I could see the flush rising in her neck. She wasn't used to pushback. I have a meeting in 10 minutes, she said abruptly. I'll check on you next week. I didn't say goodbye. I just closed the door. Later that evening, I took out the ledger again. March 5th. Groceries. Unrequested. Est. $9 dismissive visit. 7 minutes. Medicine. Comment. Unreasonable. Overpriced. You'll run out. Emotional cost. High physical cost. Hidden. I closed the book. Then I sat back in the chair and stared at the wall, letting the quiet wrap around me. There are moments in a woman's life when she realizes the line between help and harm has blurred. That care, when laced with control, isn't care at all. It's condescension. Carolyn didn't think she was being cruel. That's the part that stung. She thought she was being logical, efficient, responsible. She believed she knew best. And somewhere along the line, I had let her believe that. But not anymore. I stood up, walked to the kitchen, and made a list. Not for groceries, not for tasks, but for the things I would no longer tolerate. At the top, I wrote, "No more shrinking to fit her comfort." I didn't expect her to come back so soon, but 2 days later, there she was again, standing in my doorway with a clipboard and a brochure. "This is the home care company I told you about," she said, like we hadn't had that last conversation, like she hadn't taken my medicine and brushed off my objections like crumbs from a table. "They've got great reviews. I even spoke to someone there." I didn't invite her in. I just looked at the brochure. A smiling woman in scrubs pushing a wheelchair. The slogan read, "Compassionate support for the ones who raised us." I raised an eyebrow. That's rich. Caroline frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" "I raised you," I said quietly. "And now you want to outsource your guilt." She sighed, already irritated. "Mom, don't make this harder than it has to be." Harder? She had no idea. Hard was being 29 with a husband dying in a hospital bed and a toddler screaming in the hallway. Hard was working 2 jobs while pretending everything was fine. Hard was scraping together enough for your daughter's piano lessons while eating toast for dinner. I knew hard. She just knew inconvenience. "I don't need someone watching me like I'm a houseplant," I said, folding the brochure and handing it back. "And I don't need you arranging my life behind my back." She didn't take the paper. "I'm just trying to prepare," she snapped. "You don't see what I see. You're slowing down. You forget things." "Do I?" She opened her mouth, then closed it. "Fine. If you want to be stubborn, I want to be respected." Her face hardened, and she finally took the brochure back. "This isn't about respect, Mother. It's about reality. You're not getting younger, and I can't always be here. You need to start thinking practically." I looked her straight in the eye. "I started thinking practically the day you took my medicine." That silenced her for a moment. A flicker of guilt, or maybe just annoyance, passed across her face. "I'll call you later," she muttered, turning on her heel. I watched her walk down the steps and into her spotless SUV, watched her adjust the rearview mirror before pulling away. Then I went back inside and locked the door. That night, I opened the ledger again. March 7th. Visit. 12 minutes. Brochure. Compassionate support. Language used, stubborn, forgetful, not getting younger. Offer, nursing care for convenience, not concern. Reaction, deflection. Emotional withdrawal. Complete. I poured myself a glass of water and sat in the dark for a while. You don't raise a child thinking one day she'll look at you like a problem to be solved. You don't change diapers and stay up with fevers and sew Halloween costumes thinking that child will one day evaluate your usefulness like an expired product. But here we were. I wasn't angry anymore. Not in the way I had been. I was tired, yes. But I was also clear. And with clarity comes resolve. The next day, I made some changes. First, I called the pharmacy and set up a private PIN for all future prescriptions. Then I moved my medications to a lockbox in the kitchen drawer. I scheduled my next doctor's appointment and asked for a printed summary of my medical chart, something I hadn't done in years. Then I pulled out the fireproof box with all my financial documents and began to reread them. Slowly, carefully. I didn't have any illusions. I knew Caroline would come back, not because she wanted to, but because she needed to feel in control. And the moment she realized she didn't have it anymore, she'd panic. That night, as I prepared for bed, I felt a strange calmness. It wasn't joy, but it was close to something like peace, the kind you earn after being quiet for too long and finally hearing your own voice again. I placed the ledger on my nightstand. There were only a few lines on each page so far, but I had a feeling it would fill up quickly. And when it was full, I'd decide what came next. She didn't come for 2 weeks, not a call, not even one of her usual dry little texts. Groceries delivered or you good? Nothing. At first, I thought maybe I'd finally drawn a line she was afraid to cross. But then I remembered. Caroline never avoided conflict. She just waited until she could control the next move. That was always her way. Not yelling, planning. And I knew in my bones she was planning something. I didn't mind the silence, to be honest. It gave me space. And in that space, I began to breathe differently. I rearranged the spice drawer, took out the old photo albums, even walked to the post office one bright morning, leaning on my cane but standing tall. And I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Competent, not quick, not strong, but capable. Still me. Then, one Thursday afternoon, the phone rang. It wasn't Caroline. "Mrs. Johnson? This is Rachel from Willow Home Services. Your daughter asked us to give you a call." I didn't answer right away, just held the phone to my ear, staring out the kitchen window. My rose bush was starting to bud again, little green shoots poking through the dead growth. "Mrs. Johnson?" "Yes," I said. "I'm listening." "We understand your daughter is concerned about your well-being, and she'd like to schedule a home safety consultation. No cost to you, just to make sure your living space is secure. Slippery rugs, low lighting, that sort of thing." I pictured Caroline pacing her condo, sipping her almond milk latte, talking about liability and fall risk. "I didn't request this," I said. "No, ma'am. Your daughter did. We just need your verbal consent to proceed." I paused. Then I said, "No." Rachel hesitated. "Excuse me?" I said no. "Kindly take me off your list." She tried again, professional but persistent. "We're only here to help. It's standard for families in your situation." I smiled, though no one could see it. "What situation is that?" Another pause. "Elderly care." I let the silence grow long enough to make her shift in her chair. Then I hung up. That night, I made another entry in the ledger. March 21st. No visits, 13 days. Outsourced concern to home care agency. Attempted consultation without consent. Language used, standard, elderly, safety, autonomy threatened, yes response, no. I poured a small glass of sherry and sat in the living room with the lights low. The clock ticked. The wind brushed against the windows. And I thought about the word elderly. I don't mind being old, it's honest. But elderly is a word people use when they want to move you aside, tuck you into the corner, talk over you, make decisions for you. Robert used to say, "Old is just a year ahead. Elderly is what they call you when they stop listening." I wasn't ready to be unheard. The next morning, I pulled out my checkbook again and made a payment for my quarterly taxes. Then I sat down and wrote a letter to my financial advisor, requesting an updated statement on all my holdings. If Caroline wanted to treat me like a client instead of a mother, then she'd better know I could still balance a budget better than half the analysts at her office. Later that day, I went out to prune the roses. The ground was damp. My knees ached, but I knelt anyway. There was something beautiful about tending something that needed care. Something that would bloom, not because someone else scheduled it, but because I chose to show up. My neighbor Janice waved from across the street. "You're out early," she called. "Roses don't prune themselves," I said. She smiled. "You're tougher than you look." I smiled back, but inside I thought, no one sees how tough I've always been. And I was done hiding it. I didn't tell anyone about the spell I had that night. It wasn't dramatic. No ambulances, no collapsing on the floor. Just a slow, suffocating pressure in my chest while I stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing out a teacup. I thought maybe it was just gas, or the kind of heaviness that sometimes comes when you're tired and lonely and have too many things unsaid. But when I sat down, the pain didn't ease. It crept up into my throat, across my shoulders, a quiet alarm bell ringing in the hollows of my body. I breathed slowly, one hand on the table, the other gripping the armrest. "Don't panic," I told myself. "It might pass." And it did. 15 minutes later, it was gone, like it had never been there. But I knew. Something had shifted. I didn't call Caroline. That was the part that stayed with me the most. Not the pain, not the fear. The choice not to pick up the phone. She wouldn't have answered, not right away. And if she had, I could already hear the strain in her voice, the sigh, the scramble to make me someone else's problem. Maybe she'd tell me to call the agency again. Maybe she'd say, "You need to stop being so stubborn, Mom." No. I wanted no part of that. I made myself a cup of peppermint tea, drank it slowly, and went to bed. The next morning, I took a long look at myself in the mirror. My hair, still mostly silver, needed trimming. My skin was thinner now, and I could see every small bruise from bumping into furniture. But my eyes, they hadn't changed. Still sharp. Still mine. "Not today," I said to the reflection. "Not yet." I dressed in my softest cardigan, pulled on my walking shoes, and took a slow stroll around the block. It wasn't much, but it felt like a quiet rebellion, a reminder to myself that I was still in motion, still alive. When I got home, there was a voicemail waiting. Caroline. "Hey, Mom, I know we haven't talked much. Just checking in. Hope everything's okay. Call me if you need anything." It sounded rehearsed, like a line she had to deliver before a meeting. I didn't call back. Instead, I sat down and wrote in the ledger. March 25th. Physical episode, moderate resolved alone, no contact during after message tone, obligatory dependence reduced, reality proven emotional cost, moderate autonomy intact. Yes. Later that week, a small envelope arrived in the mail. Inside, a pamphlet from an estate planning firm. No note. Just a bright yellow sticky tab marking the page titled, "What Happens If You Become Incapacitated?" I stared at it for a long time. She wanted to be in charge, not to help, but to own the power of my decisions, to control what came next. That night, I opened the fireproof box again and began reviewing my legal documents. Will, trust, power of attorney. I hadn't updated them since Robert died. Back then, I'd made Caroline the primary contact. It had seemed logical. She was the more organized one, the one who always had a plan. Now, I saw it differently. In the quiet of my living room, I took out a notepad and wrote a list of names. People I could trust. Not many, but enough. My neighbor Janice, who checked on me without expectation. The bank advisor who always took the time to explain things clearly. My late sister's daughter, Holly, who called every month just to talk, never once asking for anything. There were still good people in my life. Caroline had just made herself a loud absence, and in that silence, I was learning to listen to everything I'd ignored. That same night, I watched an old home video, one from Caroline's 6th birthday. Robert was holding the camera, and I was lighting candles on a cake shaped like a sunflower. Caroline, in pigtails, clapped her hands and shouted, "Faster, Mommy." I did everything fast back then. Fast cake, fast cleanup, fast bedtime. I was always rushing to meet their needs. But now I moved at my own pace, and every step was mine to choose. It was the sound of the gravel crunching under tires that told me she was back. I peeked through the curtains before she made it to the porch. Same car, same brisk walk in heels too high for errands. But this time, no clipboard, no grocery bag, just her. And something tight in her face, like she was practicing being kind but hadn't quite nailed it. She knocked, softer than usual. "Mom?" I opened the door but didn't move aside. "Hi," she said, forcing a smile. "Can I come in?" I didn't answer right away, just stepped back enough to let her pass, without welcoming her. The living room was clean, sunlit, quiet. Too quiet for the kind of conversation I knew was coming. She sat down on the edge of the sofa like a guest in someone else's house. "I've been thinking," she started, smoothing out her skirt. "About everything. About you." I waited. "I know I've been a little overbearing. Maybe I pushed too hard." I still didn't say anything. She sighed. "Mom, look, I know you're proud. You've always been so independent. I admire that, really, but at some point we all have to admit we can't do everything ourselves." I raised an eyebrow. "Is that what this is about? You admitting something?" That caught her off guard. "No, I mean," she stopped herself. "I just worry." I folded my hands in my lap. "You worry enough to take my medication, to call strangers to come evaluate me, but not enough to ask how I'm sleeping, or if I've eaten." She flushed. "That's not fair." "No," I said. "It's honest." She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. After a long silence, she said, "You had an episode last week, didn't you?" I didn't ask how she knew. Probably a neighbor mentioned it, or maybe she'd actually bothered to call the pharmacy. "I managed," I said. "That's not the point. It is exactly the point." I leaned forward just slightly. "I managed. Alone. Because that's what you've left me to do." She looked down, fiddled with the hem of her sleeve. "I'm not trying to be the villain here," she said, her voice suddenly small. "I have so much on my plate, Mom. Work, the mortgage, the board meetings. It's just overwhelming sometimes. And you're not always easy to deal with." I nodded slowly. "No. I imagine it's inconvenient when your mother refuses to quietly disappear." She looked up sharply. "That's not what I meant." "No," I said. "But it's what you think." She stood up then, frustrated. "You know what? I came here to make peace. To apologize even. But if you're going to twist everything—" "I'm not twisting anything. I'm remembering." She stared at me like she didn't recognize me anymore. Maybe she didn't. "You've changed," she said. "I've returned," I corrected. She didn't like that. After a pause, she grabbed her purse. Fine. Do it your way. Just don't expect me to be around when things go south. At the door, she hesitated. I don't want to fight, Mom. I really don't. You never did, I said gently. You just wanted me quiet. She left without another word. Later that evening, I added to the ledger. April 1st. Surprise visit, unannounced. Tone, rehearsed concern, defensiveness. Language used, proud, not easy, overwhelming, make peace. Subtext, control disguised as care. Emotional tone, brittle outcome, inconclusive, unresolved. Personal clarity, rising. I sat by the window long after the sun went down, thinking about the way she'd looked at me. Like I was someone new, someone foreign. She wasn't wrong. I had returned. To myself. To the version of me who didn't apologize for needing space, or respect, or silence. There's a cost to reclaiming your voice after years of keeping it small, but there's also a reward. And tonight, I could hear it clearly. I don't think she meant to let him come. He showed up a few days later, my grandson, Jacob. 17, all limbs and energy and the faint shadow of a mustache he was proud of. He knocked like someone who wasn't sure he was welcome. Hi, Grandma. I opened the door and smiled before I could help it. Jacob, what a surprise. He held up a grocery bag like an offering. Mom said to drop these off and maybe check on you. I took the bag, apples this time, and crackers. Better than last time. Less guilt in the purchase, maybe. You want tea? I asked. He nodded quickly. Yes, please. We sat at the kitchen table and he fidgeted with a coaster while I poured 2 mugs. He didn't speak right away. Just looked around like he was remembering something. You changed the curtains, he said. 5 years ago, I smiled. But yes. He laughed softly. I guess it's been a while since I really looked. I didn't say anything. Just stirred my tea and let him come to whatever it was he'd come to say. Eventually, he cleared his throat. Mom's kind of upset. She says you're shutting her out. I raised an eyebrow. Is that what she told you? Jacob hesitated. She says you're being dramatic. That you're making things harder than they need to be. And what do you think? He looked me in the eye, then really looked, like Robert used to when something needed saying. I think she doesn't always get it, he said carefully. She means well, but she's used to being the one in charge. I sipped my tea. She's not in charge here. I know. He smiled faintly. That's probably the part she hates most. We sat in silence for a moment. Then he reached into his hoodie pocket and pulled out a small envelope. She told me not to give you this unless you seemed open. But I'm giving it to you anyway. Inside was a folded letter, Caroline's handwriting, tight, precise, emotional only by accident. I didn't open it. Should I read it now? I asked. Jacob shook his head. No. Read it when you're ready, or don't. That boy had more grace in him than most people, twice his age. He stayed for another hour. We talked about school, his plans for college, the girl he liked but hadn't told yet. I asked questions. He answered. I laughed. He smiled. And for a little while, it felt like family. Real family. Not the kind that arrives with brochures and polite tension, but the kind that lingers and eats 2 cookies without asking. When he left, he hugged me tightly, not out of obligation, but care. You're still the strongest person I know, he said, almost a whisper. After the door closed behind him, I sat back at the kitchen table and stared at the envelope. I didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, I reached for the ledger. April 5th. Visit, Jacob, unscheduled. Grocery delivery. Acceptable tone? Sincere, open message delivered, 1 envelope. Letter unopened, choice preserved. Family connection, real emotional replenishment, notable. I slipped the envelope into the drawer beside the ledger. I wasn't angry anymore. Not like before. The sharp edge of betrayal had softened. But that didn't mean I was ready to forgive what hadn't been owned. Forgiveness, in my life, had always come too quickly. I used to hand it out like tissues, to smooth things over, to keep the peace. But peace, at the price of your dignity, is just another kind of silence. And I was done with silence. The next time I opened the envelope, it was because the house was too quiet. It was one of those long, colorless afternoons when the air sits heavy and the clock ticks too loudly. I'd already finished my chores, read a chapter of my book, watered the plants. But still, the quiet pressed in like fog. So I sat down in the armchair with Caroline's letter and unfolded it. Her handwriting hadn't changed. Still tidy, slanted, impatient, like she was trying to get through it before she changed her mind. Mom, I know you're angry. I know I crossed a line. I've been thinking about that day, about the pills, and I realize now how wrong I was. I wasn't trying to hurt you, but I did. I know that. It's hard for me to see you getting older, not because I don't love you, but because it makes me feel powerless, and I hate feeling powerless. Maybe that's why I try to control things. Maybe that's why I try to manage instead of listen. You've always been so strong. It scares me to see any crack in that. I didn't mean to treat you like a problem. I know it must have felt like that. I just didn't know how else to show I care. I hope one day you'll let me make things right, but I understand if you're not ready. Love, Caroline. I read it twice. Slowly, then again, more quickly. There were no excuses in the letter. That surprised me. There was an apology, yes, and a bit of self-justification tucked between the lines. But mostly, there was something I hadn't heard from her in a long time. Vulnerability and fear. It was strange, seeing it like this. On paper, her voice sounded younger, like the girl I once knew. The one who cried when her fish died. The one who sat beside me during storms and asked if the thunder would ever break the house. She wasn't cruel. She never had been. But she had grown cold, efficient, hardened by something I couldn't quite name. Life, maybe. Or disappointment. Or just the long, slow erosion of closeness between mother and daughter when neither one says what they truly feel. I placed the letter beside me and closed my eyes. I remembered holding her the night her father died. She was 24, too grown up for lullabies, but small again in her sorrow. She hadn't let go of my hand all night. That girl was still in her somewhere. But she had built a fortress around herself, and lately she'd been trying to build one around me, too. The difference was, I'd already lived my life inside too many walls. I got up, made myself tea, and sat at the kitchen table. The ledger lay open where I'd left it. I didn't write in it that day. I just stared at the last entry, Jacob's visit, and wondered when was the last time Caroline had walked into this house and simply sat. Not advised, not managed, just sat and stayed. I didn't know. Maybe she didn't either. That evening I dialed the number to my doctor's office and scheduled a full checkup. "You want everything?" the nurse asked. "Yes," I said. "Blood work, heart scan, all of it." "All right, Mrs. Johnson, we'll book you in for next Tuesday." I hung up and marked the date on my calendar, one step at a time. Not for her, not for guilt. For me. Later, I opened a new page in the ledger, not for judgment, but for something else. April 8th. Letter received. Sincere tone, no demands, acknowledgement of harm, present signs of vulnerability, evident trust, not restored, but acknowledged. Reaction, thoughtful, cautious action, self-care initiated emotion, bittersweet, steady. I folded the letter and placed it inside the back cover of the ledger. I wasn't ready to answer, but I wasn't angry anymore. And that, too, was a kind of healing. It was raining when the phone rang. Not a soft spring drizzle, but a loud, insistent downpour that slapped the windows and turned the street outside into a river. I was in the living room, folding laundry. Slow, methodical, the way you do when the day has no real beginning or end. The phone rang again. I checked the screen. Caroline. I answered without saying hello. Her voice cracked before she even got through the first sentence. Mom, I need help. It was not the voice of a woman trying to be polite or persuasive. It was raw, frightened, exposed. What happened? She tried to speak, then stopped. I could hear her breathing, quick and shallow. I'm at the hospital, she said finally. They found something. The words came in fragments. A lump, a scan. The phrase needs surgery immediately. She was alone. She hadn't told anyone yet, not even Jacob. And she didn't know how to say it without sounding like she was already falling apart. They say I need the operation by the end of the week, she whispered. And my insurance, it won't cover it all. The surgeon I trust, he's considered out of network. I felt the shift before I let myself name it. There it was, the request. And beneath it, the old expectation. The silent calculation that had always followed every call. She'll help. She always does. How much? I asked quietly. 27, she said. Maybe 30 with post-op care. I don't have that. A pause. You do. It wasn't accusatory, just factual. Yes, I did. She knew I did, and we both knew what came next. The pause before the ask. Mom, will you help me? My hand tightened around the phone. The rain beat harder against the windows. The sky outside was the color of old bruises. I didn't answer right away. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I just sat there, breathing, hearing the rain and her shallow desperation on the other end of the line. Then I said it. No. She went silent. I could feel the weight of it settle between us like a dropped plate. No, she repeated, as if she hadn't understood. I'm sorry, Caroline, I said, but I won't be paying for the surgery. The silence stretched. I don't understand, she said finally. You're punishing me? No, I said gently. I'm protecting myself. But I'm your daughter. Yes, I said. And I was your mother when you took my medicine, when you spoke over me, when you made plans about my care without me. And I said nothing. For years, I said nothing. This is different, she said, her voice rising. No, I replied. It's not. She tried again. Mom, this is serious. This isn't about groceries or old arguments. It's about patterns, I said, and boundaries, and the fact that I'm not your emergency fund, I'm not your insurance plan, I'm your mother. There was a long silence. I could hear her breathing, tighter now, almost trembling. I never thought you'd say no, she said, barely above a whisper. I know, I said. That's the problem. Then I ended the call. My hands shook as I set the phone down. Not from guilt, but from the sheer force of how long I'd been waiting to say that word and truly mean it. No, it echoed in the quiet. It felt like breathing for the first time. I opened the ledger with steady fingers and wrote, April 12th. Phone call. Urgent request. $30,000 medical emergency. Verified tone. Fear, expectation, assumption. Response given, no emotional cost, high emotional return. Freedom. I closed the book and stared out the window. The rain was still coming down hard, but I didn't feel cold. I felt whole. Let the storm rage. I had found shelter, and for the first time in years, it was in myself. The fallout came quickly. That night, I turned my phone off. I didn't want to hear the barrage, the outrage, the guilt-laced appeals disguised as concern. I knew her, knew the rhythm of her emotions. Shock would turn into pleading, then into anger, then into blame. I had finally stepped out of the role she'd written for me, and she had no idea what to do with a mother who said no. The next morning, I turned the phone back on. 37 missed calls, 8 voicemails, and 2 messages from Jacob, just asking if I was okay. Only his I listened to. Hey, Grandma, Mom's really upset. I don't know everything, but she said you two had a fight. Just checking in. Call me when you want. And the second? Later that night. I'm here if you need anything. I love you. I didn't cry. But something in my chest softened. A small break in the tightness that had lived there too long. Then came the visit. I saw her car before I heard the knock, parked half on the curb like she'd rushed over, not even caring if she was crooked in her haste. She didn't bother to ring, just knocked, hard, 3 times. I opened the door slowly. Caroline stood there, arms crossed, coat soaked from the drizzle. You really meant it, she said. No hello, no pretense. Yes. You're seriously letting me go through this alone? I'm not letting you do anything, I said calmly. You're not a child. Her jaw clenched. It's surgery, Mom, not a shopping spree. I know. She stared at me, waiting for something. Regret, guilt, apology. I gave her none. You're punishing me, she said again, low and bitter. No, I said. I'm drawing a line. One I should have drawn years ago. She stepped inside without being invited, dripping rain onto my rug. I gave up so much for you, she hissed. All those years. I stayed after Dad died. I helped run this house. I put off grad school. And now, when I need you. You didn't stay for me, I said, voice firm. You stayed because you didn't know where else to go. And that house you helped run? I paid the bills. I cleaned it. I held it together while you watched. Her eyes filled, not with tears, but with fury. You really think I've been using you all this time? No, I said. I think you stopped seeing me as a person. She blinked. That one landed. Then, quietly, and Jacob? Are you going to cut him off too? I shook my head. He hasn't asked for anything. She flinched. That's not fair. No, I said, but it's honest. The silence between us was thick. I'm scared, she whispered. I know, I said gently, but fear doesn't entitle you to everything you've taken. She looked at me for a long moment, then shook her head like she didn't recognize the woman standing in front of her. I hope you sleep well, she muttered, and walked out without another word. I didn't follow her, didn't call after her. Just stood there, letting the rain-soaked air fill the doorway before I closed it. That evening, I made a cup of tea and opened the ledger again. April 13th. Visit, aggressive tone. Accusations, manipulation, punishment. Language used, alone, deserve, I gave up so much. Core message, entitlement disguised as sacrifice. Boundary held, firmly emotional cost, sharp emotional clarity, complete. I stared at the page for a long time. Then, without knowing why, I flipped back through the older pages. So many entries, so many little moments where I gave up a piece of myself without protest. So many tiny deaths in the name of peace. But not this time. This time I kept something. This time I kept myself. The silence afterward wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that pressed in at the edges, like a draft seeping through the cracks of an old house. It didn't ache exactly, but it reminded me of what had just been said, of what had just been lost, but also of what had been reclaimed. Caroline didn't call. Not the next day. Not the day after. And neither did Jacob. I imagined she'd told him something. Maybe not a lie, but her version of the truth, polished with just enough omission to keep her in the role of the injured party. That was always her way. I kept waiting for the guilt to arrive, for the old reflex to kick in, to smooth things over, to reach out, to fix. But it didn't. Not this time. Instead, something else arrived. Stillness, not emptiness, not regret, just stillness. And with it came an unexpected guest. Relief. I was no longer holding the weight of someone else's expectations. I wasn't waiting for the next request, the next subtle insult wrapped in false concern, the next reminder that I had value only when I was useful. I had said no, and the sky hadn't fallen. Instead, the rain had stopped. I took advantage of the quiet. I cleaned out the closet in the back room, the one where Robert used to keep his tools, then Caroline, her boxes of old paperwork and forgotten electronics. I found photo albums, old receipts, a tangle of cords that led to nothing. And at the very back, a small metal box I'd almost forgotten. Inside, copies of every check I'd written her in the last 10 years. Not because she asked for records. She never did. But because some part of me needed to keep them. Maybe even then, I was preparing for this moment. A moment where memory alone wouldn't be enough. There were dozens of them. Tuition payments, business loans, car repairs, a down payment on her first condo, 3 separate emergency transfers when she'd miscalculated her taxes. Altogether, nearly $100,000. I sat on the floor and stared at the numbers. She had called all of it help. But not once had she asked what I needed, whether I had enough, whether I felt safe or lonely or scared. It was always assumed. Mother manages, mother provides, and now, when I chose myself, she called it cruel. That night, I opened the ledger again. April 15th. Communication. Non-emotional state. Clear, grounded financial review, 96 Fowler 38 over 10 years. Gratitude received. Minimal recognition, absent current resolve. Unshaken ledger. Purpose. Confirmed I didn't know what Caroline would do. Whether she'd find another way to pay for the surgery. Whether she'd ask Jacob's father or take out a loan or set up a fundraiser with one of those sorrowful captions. What I did know, what settled in my bones like a truth that had always been there, was that I could no longer rescue someone who had never once tried to protect me. The next morning, I walked to the mailbox and found a single white envelope addressed by hand. It wasn't Caroline's handwriting. Inside, a card. Dear Mrs. Johnson, this is Holly, your niece. Jacob called me, worried, and I thought I'd write. I don't know all the details and I don't need to. I just want you to know. If you ever need anything, I'm here. I mean that. And Grandma would have been proud of you. Love, Holly. I sat on the porch with the card in my hands, the wind stirring the hem of my robe. That girl, that young woman now, had always seen me, even when Caroline didn't. When she was little, She used to draw me pictures with shaky crayon lines. Auntie Martha and her flowers, Auntie Martha and the pie. I kept everyone. It reminded me that the story didn't end with Caroline, that there were other threads in the fabric of my life, some frayed, some forgotten, but still strong, still holding. I took out a pen and wrote back to Holly. Thank you. I'm okay, but your letter meant more than you know. And then I added one more line. I'm starting over, and I'm not doing it alone. It was a quiet Saturday when I heard from Jacob again. Not a call, not a visit. Just a small knock, gentle, almost shy. And there he was on the porch, holding a paper bag in both hands. Hey, Grandma. I opened the door and felt the same soft warmth I always did when I saw him. I brought pastries, he said, from that place you like, the one with the tiny orange rolls. I stepped aside without a word and let him in. He walked past me like he'd done it 100 times before, because he had, and set the bag carefully on the kitchen counter. I didn't know if you'd be up for company, he said, but I figured maybe you'd be okay with me. He didn't say, after what happened. He didn't have to. We sat down with tea and the pastries, and for a while, we just ate in silence. No heavy talk, no tension, just cinnamon and citrus, and the sound of a spoon tapping the side of a mug. After the second cup of tea, he finally spoke. She's still mad. I nodded. I figured. She thinks you don't care what happens to her. I raised an eyebrow. Is that what you think? He shook his head. No, I think you've always cared. Even when she didn't know how to say thank you. He looked older that day, not just in the face, in the way he carried himself, like he'd seen things he didn't want to see, heard things he couldn't unhear. She told me not to come, he added quietly. I blinked. And you came anyway? I needed to see for myself, he said, to make sure you were still you. I smiled. And? He smiled back. You are, maybe more than ever. That was the thing about Jacob. He saw clearly, and he didn't flinch from what he saw. He reached into his jacket and pulled out another envelope. This one thick, sealed, addressed in Caroline's handwriting again. I didn't reach for it. She said she was writing everything down. Said she needed to explain, but not over the phone. She's scared, Grandma. Not just of the surgery. She's scared of how she treated you. I leaned back in the chair. She's never said that to me. She can't, Jacob said. Not yet. But she knows. I didn't take the envelope, not because I was angry, not because I'd hardened, but because some things don't need to be read right away. And some truths, once spoken, can wait until you're ready to feel them fully. Instead, I placed my hand over his. I'm proud of you, I said. You're learning faster than your mother ever did. He looked down, then back at me. I just don't want to lose both of you. I didn't say what I was thinking. You already lost pieces of her years ago. Instead, I said, you won't. He left an hour later, but not before washing the dishes and wiping down the counter like he'd grown up doing it. He hadn't. That was Caroline's way. But I'd taught him enough on the visits we did have, and he'd remembered. After he left, I sat down at the kitchen table again and opened the ledger. April 20th. Visit Jacob Pastries. Thoughtful, personal. Update. Carolyn still angry. Scared envelope received. Unopened emotional tone. Soft, respectful family link. Preserved line held intact. Then I turned the page. Not just in the book. Inside myself. There was something freeing in realizing that you didn't have to hate someone to protect yourself from them. That love, too, could come with boundaries. That forgiveness could take its time. I didn't know what I would do with Caroline's letter. Maybe I'd read it tomorrow. Maybe I wouldn't. But I knew one thing with certainty. I had stopped asking for her to change. Now I was changing. And that had made all the difference. I didn't read the letter the next day, or the day after that. It sat on the table like a guest I wasn't ready to greet, patient, heavy with meaning, but silent. I walked past it a dozen times. Sometimes I looked at it. Once I almost opened it. But something in me said, not yet. Instead, I took long walks when the weather allowed. I returned to baking, not for anyone, just for myself. I cleaned out the pantry, rearranged my books, even polished the silver. There was comfort in doing the things that no one saw, but still mattered. And I began to sleep better. I hadn't realized how shallow my rest had become over the years. How often I lay still with my eyes closed, but my thoughts racing. What if she called in a crisis? What if I missed something? What if saying no had been too much? But now, when I lay down, the silence was clean. I was no longer preparing for the next demand. I was simply resting. Then, a week later, a small package arrived. Not from Caroline, from Jacob. Inside, a book, a blank journal, cream-colored pages, unlined, heavy in the hand. And a note written in pencil. I figured maybe it's time to start writing things that aren't just records. Love you. I ran my hand over the cover. There was something in that. Something more generous than he probably realized. An invitation not to forget, but to live beyond. That evening, I placed the blank journal beside the ledger. One for the things I had given. One for the things I would now create. I still didn't open Caroline's letter. But that night, I dreamed of her. Not as she was now. Bitter and tight-jawed, but as a child. Running barefoot in the backyard, hair loose, shouting, "Watch me, Mama!" as she climbed the fig tree Robert planted the year she was born. I woke with tears in my eyes. Not from pain, from memory. Later that morning, I sat on the porch with my tea and stared out at the quiet street. Birds hopped along the sidewalk. A neighbor jogged by and waved. The air smelled like earth and the first cut grass of the season. And I realized something. I was no longer waiting. Not for an apology. Not for reconciliation. Not for time to rewind itself. I had arrived at a new place. One where her love, flawed, inconsistent, no longer held me hostage. One where I could still hold the good without denying the harm. And maybe that was what forgiveness truly was. Not saying it's okay, but saying it happened. I see it clearly, and I choose to go on anyway. I opened the ledger again. April 27th. Letter, still unread. Emotional clarity, deepening sleep, restored gift from Jacob. Symbolic, generous emotional shift. Memory without bitterness. New beginning, forming. Then I reached for the blank journal. On the first page I wrote, "Today I planted rosemary in the garden. It reminded me of Robert, and of how much I still know how to grow." I smiled at the sentence. Simple. True. The rosemary would come up green and strong, even if no one noticed, even if no one praised it. It would grow because that's what it was meant to do. And so would I. The letter stayed sealed for another week. By then, the spring had fully turned. The kind of shift that doesn't ask for permission. My garden came alive all at once. Tulips opened. The air turned warm enough to leave the windows cracked. I no longer needed the heavy cardigan in the mornings. I still hadn't heard from Caroline, and I hadn't expected to. Some silences are loud with waiting. Others are simply final. This one felt like something in between. Not an end, but not a beginning either. A long, unspoken pause between mother and daughter, filled with too many versions of love, none of them the same. That afternoon, I went to the backyard. The rosemary had taken root, small, firm stems already thickening. I ran my hand across the top and brought my fingers to my nose. Memory bloomed. I knelt slowly, dug a small hole near the edge of the garden, and placed a new plant in the ground. Not rosemary this time, but marigolds. Bright, unapologetic yellow. The kind of flower that thrives with little help, yet never fades quietly. When I stood up, my knees stiff, I saw the envelope waiting on the patio chair. I had brought it out with me, without deciding to, just in case. I sat down, held it for a moment, and finally opened it. The handwriting was the same, neat, reserved, like she was afraid of the words slipping out wrong. "Mom, I'm sorry. I said it before, but not like this. Not with the space and weight it deserves. I was scared when I took your medicine. Scared because it felt like time was speeding up, and I was losing control. Not just of your health, but of our roles. I didn't want to see you as vulnerable, because that meant I had to stop needing you. And I wasn't ready for that. But that's not an excuse. I treated you like a problem, like something to manage. I see that now. And I hate that I made you feel small when you've always been the strongest person I know. You were right to say no. Even though it hurt. The surgery went well. In case Jacob didn't tell you. I didn't want to make you feel guilty by calling after. But I wanted you to know I'm healing. Slowly. I don't expect anything from you, Mom. Not anymore. I'm not writing to ask. I'm writing to tell you. I miss you. Not the caretaker. Not the safety net. Just you. I don't know how to fix what I broke, but I'd like to learn. If you're ever ready, I'll be here. Love, Caroline. I read it once, then again. There was no plea, no demand. Just an offering. That's what struck me most. Not the words themselves, but the shift in them. For the first time in years, Caroline wasn't asking me to step in, to fix, to be the quiet answer. She was standing at her own edge now, waiting. I didn't feel a rush of forgiveness. That's not how it works. Not after so much silence and subtraction. But I did feel something new. A soft space. The possibility of a new kind of relationship. Not mother and daughter bound by need and duty, but two women side by side. Still bruised, but breathing. I didn't write back. Not yet. But I opened the journal Jacob had given me, and on a clean page, I wrote, "Today, she said she misses me. Just me. And for the first time, I believe she meant it." 2 weeks passed. I didn't call her. She didn't call me. But I felt the letter in the house like a new kind of silence. Not the old, heavy one filled with resentment and distance, but something lighter, more open, like a room where the window's finally been cracked, letting air move again. The rosemary had filled out. The marigolds bloomed taller than I'd expected. Every morning, I sat on the back steps with my tea, watching the wind push through them. Something about their movement made me feel less alone. Then, one morning, a knock. Not rushed, not sharp, just gentle. I opened the door. Caroline stood there. No makeup, no folder, no grocery bag, just her, wearing an old cardigan I hadn't seen in years, Mine once. She used to borrow it when she was cold. She didn't speak right away. Neither did I. Finally, she said, "I brought coffee." She held up a small paper tray with 2 cups. From the place near the park, not the chain she always liked. Mine. I stepped aside. We sat in the kitchen. She took the seat across from me like she had 1,000 times before, but this time she didn't fill the space with words. No explanations. No apologies. Just a sip of coffee in the quiet between us. I let her be the first to speak. "Jacob told me you're planting again." I nodded. "Something to do with my hands." She smiled, but it was soft, careful. "I used to love watching you work in the garden." "I don't think I ever told you that." I looked at her, really looked. She seemed smaller somehow, not weaker, just more real, like someone who'd finally stopped performing strength and started looking for something truer. She set her cup down. "I don't want to talk about the surgery," she said, "or the money, or what happened." I waited. "I want to ask if we can try again." I didn't move. "Not the same way," she said quickly. "Not me in charge, not you quietly agreeing. I mean, really try, to talk, to know each other, as people." That word again. People, not roles, not obligations. I leaned back in my chair. "Why now?" She looked down, picked at a spot on the cardboard cup. "Because the worst thing that could have happened to me already did. You said no, and I survived. And somewhere in the middle of all that anger, I realized something." I waited. "I miss knowing you." My throat tightened. "I don't want to rewrite history," she said. "I don't expect you to pretend nothing happened. But I don't want to keep living as if we're both just surviving each other." I closed my eyes for a moment, then opened them. "All right?" She blinked. "All right?" "We can try," I said. "But no performances, no negotiations. If we're going to talk, we do it honestly. I'm too old for half-truths." She smiled, not the tight, polite one I'd grown used to. A real smile, uncertain, but there. "I'd like that." She stood, slowly. "I should go. I just wanted to say it." At the door, she paused. "I brought you something else." She handed me a small cloth bag. Inside, rosemary oil. "Homemade," the label said. A little handwritten tag, "For the joints and the memories." I looked up. Her eyes were wet. "I didn't know what else to bring," she whispered. "But I remembered how it smells on your hands after you prune it." I nodded, unable to speak. After she left, I sat down at the table and opened the journal. May 12th. Today, she came back without expecting to be forgiven. She just came to be known. And for the first time in years, I let her. The ledger stayed closed. Not because it no longer mattered, but because I didn't need to write in it every day now. The things that had happened still happened. The pain still lived in those pages. But something had shifted. There was space now, for healing, for limits, for a different kind of love. And maybe that's what I'd been waiting for all along. Not a daughter who would do things right, but a daughter who would stop pretending and let me be real too. If you've read this far, thank you. Thank you for hearing the quiet parts, for sitting with the stillness between what was said and what was meant. Thank you for not looking away from what hurts, and for recognizing when a woman decides to stop shrinking. If this story reminded you of something unspoken in your own life, a boundary you haven't drawn, a truth you haven't told, a silence you've accepted too long, then maybe it's your turn. You don't have to raise your voice to reclaim your dignity. You just have to stop whispering your needs like they're a burden. If this spoke to you, share it. Leave a comment. Let someone else know they're not alone in what they feel, but don't say. We are many. We've just been quiet too long,